All right, we're here again talking about flourishing worship. I'm so excited to be working through this, just as we're discussing as a church how worship is important, not only in singing, but also in the bigger scheme of things. Worship is a lot of things, but today we are focusing primarily a lot on the idea of worshiping together through music, through focus, through corporate worship, through individual worship, all those different things. I'm here with Brittany and Aaron Senseman, who your almost entire history together has been worship leadership, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, I love that. Your story is, when you're married in a ministry, ideally you both have the same calling. And it's very clear that you do. I think sometimes a spouse comes along because they know it's important and they want to be helpful, but it's pretty obvious that y'all are both called to this separately and God wove you together in a cool way. So I love that about you. So we're going to jump right in. We're going to be talking a little bit about the 10 Commandments. I'll read those real quick, not all of them, but the first 4, and then we'll jump into a conversation. Exodus 22-11 says this. It says, "I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven, above or on earth, beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the 3rd and 4th generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name." And finally it says, "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath day to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." So the 10 Commandments, they're something that, if you grew up in church, you hear a lot about. I have never really thought about it until working on this conversation, that the first 4 genuinely are focused on worship. Like it's really about putting God first and foremost. So what are some struggles or hardships that we can face if we fail to worship God and keep him first in our lives?
Well, as you just pointed out, I mean, it's clear that we're commanded in Scripture to worship. And as I think about it, worship is about remembrance. It's about remembering who God is and remembering who we are as his people, as his children. And I think the failure to simply recognize that means that it's going to manifest in our lives in some unhealthy ways. And we're going to, we're going to do things that reflect we are at the center of our life. That's kind of man's default position is, I know what's best. And we were talking about this, and that's, one of the things that you brought into the conversation was that, when we say, I know what's best for me, that's when we begin to go awry. And so maybe you...
Yeah, we were in preparation for this. We were talking about it. And I think my greatest temptation about in my failure to worship is when bad things happen, right? When somebody goes through a divorce, they lose a loved one, they get a tough diagnosis. I'm tempted to think it's not fair. And when I think it's not fair, it is difficult for me to worship, because me thinking it's not fair is really me saying, I know better.
Right.
And that means I'm acting like God instead of giving God his due and recognizing that God knows better because he's who he says he is. He is God. And I think worship is key to help me remember that God is who he says he is. And it helps me participate in giving him that acknowledgement and reminding myself that I'm not. And there's, I think, a freedom to be found in that reality that when I feel like I am, if I feel like I'm in charge, that's a huge pressure.
Yeah. And
so actually worship frees me to say, oh, thank goodness I'm not in charge.
I love that you say that about it, reminding you that God's in charge and putting your focus on him, because as someone who I work in ministry, I think about worship a lot. Whenever a song comes through that has a lot of me's or I's or us, I'm like, gosh, this doesn't really, it's not doing what you're saying it should. Not saying that those songs are bad or they're not, positive messages, but there are moments where I'm like, I need to be reminded that it's not about me. And if a song says me and I and how I feel too many times, it's not doing, I think, what you said that it should do. And I'm not going to have you call out any songs, but So I hate this song. But we've all heard those songs that like, this isn't really directing my heart to God. And that does complicate things. And so, Aaron, this is kind of, not on the paper, but when you're choosing songs as a worship leader, how does that idea of making sure people are thinking about God like play into your choices?
What I try to focus on most is what is true. My philosophy in terms of choosing worship songs has kind of grown into this. I mean, first of all, yes, if something is, vertically oriented, meaning that we are talking about God and God's attributes and who we are before Him and declaring those things, that's to me going to be better than a song that is just talking about our emotional state or our even our posture at times. But it's one of those things where when you look at what songs resonate with people, I feel like as a worship pastor and leader, it's very important that I consider more than just, the people really like that song.
Right.
Sometimes it's right for us to step in and say, well, it's a little bit off base here, or it leans a little too far toward the emotional side of things.
Right.
But I think that if you choose songs based on, first of all, is what it's saying true? That's the most important thing, because after that, if it's not true, then why in the world would we sing that?
Right.
Especially these things are often quite repetitive, and so we're repeating things over and over again. And even if they're just a little bit off base, or even if they may cause a new believer to have some misunderstandings about foundational elements of faith, that's something we got to really pay attention to. And then beyond that, is it presented in a style that's going to resonate with people? I think is an important question for us to ask. It doesn't have to be the deciding factor.
Right.
But I think that if you're, if you have a congregation that's composed of a lot of senior adults and you're doing speed metal or something like that, that's probably not a good choice, even if what you're saying is, orthodox. But
at the same time, we're not doing Gregorian chant anymore. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's just absolutely not going to engage our hearts the same way.
So
that's huge. Well, I love that. So this is also talking about the idea of the Sabbath and remembering the Sabbath and keeping it holy. And Sabbath is a word that we try and say, well, it means Sunday or it means this. It's obviously a big concept that I think we kind of dumb down a little bit too much. But so in your own words, like, how would you explain the meaning of what it means to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy? Like, what does that mean, Brittany?
So I've been doing this Bible reading plan, and in that, going through the Old Testament, and they talk a lot about this, and it really actually matters quite a bit. And, in Jewish law, and they had so many rules about it. And that is so foreign to me in this time. And so like you say, the concept of Sabbath is confusing, and I don't think we have a good equivalent now. But one of the things that I kind of learned in my reading is the idea of Sabbath is to remind us of our dependence, because you couldn't work on the Sabbath. And back then, like, not working meant you might not have enough food because they were so close to the ground, just as a culture. And so it was like, I'm going to trust that God is going to provide the food, the work, whatever literally life-sustaining elements for myself, for my family, and I'm going to put it down and trust that God has it. And so now, thinking of that concept now, like, what does that look like? Is it a day? Is it, I'm not a big formula person. I'm not a big rule person, but I am a big concept and truth person. And so I think it is essential that we figure out what Sabbath means as a reflection of my dependence on God. And this, again, it goes back to worship, right? Because it's all about God being who He says He is. And these are just varying disciplines and ways of demonstrating that truth.
That is really profound. I have never thought about this idea of Sabbath being, I'm giving up work time to serve, like, this is what I need to survive, and I'm foregoing that for a day. Because in our day and age, it's not that way. I get a salary, I'm an annual salary. Like, it doesn't mean the same thing, but that is really huge. I love that you share that. Aaron, you got anything to add to that?
I mean, I think that in that context, one of the verses that I go back to often when I'm challenged in this context is I think it's in 1 Samuel, to obey is better than sacrifice. And so while, yes, it was, keeping the Sabbath was a much bigger sacrifice for people who lived during the Old Testament times, for the reasons that she, clearly articulated, it's an act of obedience. And I think, Scripture is replete with instances where, obedience is prized by God. I mean, Christ says, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. Then you will know the truth. People like to quote that verse, you shall know the truth and the truth will make you free. But they forget about the preceding verse, which is, if you love me, you will do what? You will keep my commandments.
Right.
Then you'll know the truth. And then if you go back even to Cain and Abel, you see that they both presented offerings to the Lord. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we know exactly why, but there was, you could look on both of those as a sacrifice.
Right.
But Abel's sacrifice was pleasing to the Lord and Cain's was not. Mm-hmm. And so it isn't simply that we sacrifice, it is that we obey. And I think that we can fool ourselves a little bit with, or we can rationalize. We're very good at this. Just as a people, as human beings, we rationalize a lot of things about our behavior. And we need to make sure that we are not rationalizing our way out of obedience because, we tithe or we do this or that. And so when it comes to the Sabbath, we don't really challenge ourselves. We don't really consider it as a part of the discipline of worship.
Right.
And we need to do this.
Yeah. Well, talking about this idea of Sabbath, and somehow it's based on Scripture, but we so closely relate singing and music to Sabbath. I mean, we think of Sunday church, like having music, like having that. So what role does music and singing play in keeping the Sabbath holy or making it kind of that special moment? Like what role does it play?
Well, I mean, one thing that comes to mind is in corporate worship anyway, it's a declaration that we're making together as God's people. So there's a unifying thing about this. There's also something about music that is so much more penetrative. When you hear an idea, and obviously this can be true more for some than others because some people are more affected by music. But I think that, just take, for instance, watching a movie. I mean, if there's something sad happening in the movie and it's just dialogue, you say, wow, that's really sad. But if there's sad music playing behind it,
right,
then you're weeping all of a sudden. And it's this completely different experience. And it's so much, it brings this deeper reality. It has a way of causing us to realize the real depth of the truth involved. And I think that's something that music clearly does for us, whether that's in a corporate setting or in an individual setting. Yeah.
A friend of mine this summer, her mom was diagnosed with cancer and she passed away. And we Marco Polo, that, video app, back and forth. And so we were talking and she just sent me this message that was so hard and heavy. And I was so burdened and there's nothing I could do. There was I can't cure cancer. Right. I can't, there was no way for me to solve this, but I was so burdened. And I immediately, it was so funny to me afterwards, but I immediately went to the piano and started playing that Sandra McCracken song, Be Still My Soul, as like you're saying, just as an expression of the burden that I was feeling. And it was a way for me to remind myself that God tells me to still my soul and that I can because he's my hope. Yeah. And so it's like I was able to access the hope that I needed in that moment, feeling so heavy. But I think like sitting there, just hearing the message, words weren't enough. It was like I needed, and we're musicians. And so I realized not everyone's going to go sit down at their piano and play a song, but there is something about, I think, humanity that we
Right.
respond so deeply to
Yeah,
music.
that's true. Like, there's so few people in the world that if you ask them, like, what kind of music you listen to, they would say, oh, no, I just listen to silence. Like, everyone's got like a type of music that does something for them, that evokes something in them. And it just kind of speaks to the almost universal idea that like you said, music is woven deeper into us, and it causes us to feel things in more significant ways. And so when you tie that with worshiping God, when you tie that with focusing on the Savior of the Lord of the world, it's going to make it even that much more meaningful and special and holy. And then, like you said, corporately together, which I do want to talk about a little bit, this idea of worshiping individually versus the idea of worshiping with other people. How are individual and corporate worship, like, how are they the same? Like, what are some things that they share in common that you can do both by yourself and with other people?
Well, like we said, the purpose of worship is declaring to God and to oneself like who he is. And I think of it as an orientation process, actually, where it's like you think of a compass and worship, whether individually or in a group, it's me orienting myself to, again, God is God, I am not, and we are clear. Like that is a clear. So in that way, they are the same.
Yeah, I love that. What about you, Aaron? How are they similar? Because, on your own and together, like, they're very different, of course, but what are the similarities? How do they kind of work together? How do they do the same things?
So I think there are so many things that, for instance, if we're going through a particular book of the Bible, if we're going through that as a congregation, there are going to be threads that we're all experiencing either culturally or from a community standpoint. There are things that you can experience together. I mean, think about going to a concert or going to a baseball game or something where you're united in this this either pursuit or this recognition, this vibe, even this, and we're using some emotional language that I don't think is always out of place, but it's important in worship that we remember the purpose is not the emotional response, but the emotional response can be a part of, it can be a genuine part of what is happening. And I think when we experience that together as a congregation, again, it's a way of recognizing some deeper truths, and it's a unifying aspect of who we are as God's people. When we declare things together, when we experience things together, it's something that will propel us into kingdom work and encourage us. I think, to be roused as a congregation is an experience that happens, that obviously can only happen in community. And when we are challenged in a way, or when we are admonished in a way that reveals things to us as a community, it's an important experience that can only be. I think I'm wandering from actually what your question was.
No, but we'll get there. No. What you're saying is good. I want to talk about why is corporate worship special and why is individual worship special? Because there are some people in the world who would probably say, man, my times with the Lord alone are so important. They're the most important thing to me. And some people would say, like, man, being with my church, that's the best thing. And I'd like to leave today giving clear explanation of why they're both important. Like, so you're talking a lot about corporate worship and why it's special. And you can continue that if you want. But I also want to talk about why is individual worship special? Like, why is that important? And so that we don't say one is better than the other. We say that they're both equally important. What roles do they each play? How are they both, special?
I think one of the things we talked about yesterday was that your life change doesn't often happen in a corporate setting. I mean, it certainly can. I mean, but I almost feel like in the corporate setting, we cry out to God together. We do these things together. We express some of these deeper truths together, but we're not always listening as much for God to speak to us.
Sure.
And that happens more on the individual level. And I think that's why individual moments of worship are so important, because it's not that God can't pierce through the experience of corporate worship. He often does that, and he can reveal things to you in corporate worship, but it's those quiet times when we are setting aside specifically to listen for God's voice.
Right.
In individual worship. I mean, that's certainly been true in my life. Doing this as a job, it often makes it very difficult to hear God speaking in corporate times, because I'm leading those times, and so my mind is full of just the machinations of what's happening. So I think that for me, that's, times of individual worship are particularly important, for people who are vocational pastors.
Right.
Well, and I think just logistically, we can't all get together all the time.
Right.
Right.
So you have to have your own, and again, we discussed this loop that exists of that we have the opportunity to participate in, that we've been talking about this whole time, just that God is who he is, and I rest in that truth, and he's my hope and my peace, and all of those things. Worship is our participation in that loop where he speaks to me, I speak to him. Like it's just this constant conversation. And because we can't get together all the time, I would hate to wait for Sundays, to have that experience, I need that. Like I need that strength, that hope, that peace on a more than weekly basis.
Right.
And so I think the individual worship is huge just for living a Christian life. And it enables us to, I think you said this earlier, it enables us to be better Christians, honestly. I think, again, participating in that restorative loop, it's like I can love better. I can be at peace better. I'm less stressed. Like there's research around this.
Right.
I mean, and even physiologically, singing, they've done research around that and how singing calms us. It doesn't even matter. Like these are non-Christians who are doing this research, and it is calming. And I'm like, of course it is. Like God designed us this way, and how beautiful that is, that this practice that we get to participate in and that we value and we prioritize has so many good things that it brings back for us.
It's almost like working out. I mean,
Exactly.
it is a discipline unto itself. It is exercise, and it can be cathartic, and certainly it could be even confessional in either a corporate or individual context. Right. And it is that, this restorative loop that we cry out to God and he answers us. Yeah. I mean, and it brings healing and encouragement to our spirit. And that is certainly some way in which it's similar, because that happens corporately and individually.
Yeah. One thing that's comes up a lot of times when you're ministering to somebody or trying to encourage somebody in their faith, especially younger people in their faith, they'll say, wow, I just don't feel the same way in worship as I used to. Sunday mornings don't feel the same way. And the first question that my mentor would ask this type of person, I learned from him, was like, well, what are you doing the rest of the week? What does your relationship with God look like the rest of the week? And if you're just showing up on Sundays expecting to have this incredible cathartic moment, that's going to last for 6 months because it's new and exciting. But there's going to come a time where if you're doing nothing else the rest of the week, that corporate moment is not going to be as powerful as it would be if you had individual moments as well. So for a young believer, maybe someone who's new to the faith, what would you say are some personal habits or spiritual disciplines they could incorporate to strengthen their personal times of worship and also their corporate times of worship?
I think it starts with a decision. I think it, because you're not going to feel like it. I mean, that's just like you're saying, any exercise, anything. There are days you don't want to work out, like lots of days for me. But it's a decision that this is either important to me or it's not. Mm-hmm. And God takes his worship really seriously for a good reason. Like I just said, it does all of these great things. It's not, he doesn't need it. It's for us. Right. And so I think it starts with a decision that, okay, if this is important to me, what does that mean? When I look at my calendar, what does that mean? Right. So you have to put it on there. I mean, it's just, I think it's the decision, because if you wait until you feel like it, it's not going to happen. Yeah, it's huge.
One of the things that was helpful to me is one of my mentors, he said this, I'll never forget it. I think it's important for all of us to remember. He said, never judge the state of your relationship with God by the quality of your experience. And I think that is so important to remember in the context of worship, because like she said, it's a decision. We're commanded to worship. And if we just say, I just don't feel like it. Right. Well, that's okay. It's okay that you don't feel like it, but it's not okay to not do it.
Right.
because you need to do it, because
And I've
sometimes
never felt worse after worshiping.
right.
I mean,
Yeah.
I've never felt worse.
Right.
I don't always have like
It doesn't necessarily make everything better.
Yeah.
right,
Yes.
exactly.
But
Yeah.
right.
But it's not going to make you feel worse.
Yeah.
And at the very least, you will have been consistent with what you said is
Yeah.
important, and that in and of itself just feels better.
Yeah, I love that. It's such a hard line to walk between a discipline and a joy. You know what I'm saying? And finding joy in a discipline. And I think worship is probably one of the best examples of that, because, yeah, there are moments where you can come in and not be in a good place with God and really have had a hard week. And worship is exactly what you need to feel close to Him. And then there's other weeks where you come in with the exact same feelings of it's been hard and it doesn't do what it did
Right.
last time.
Right.
And so you start trying to think of, well, what am I doing wrong? How do I make this moment better? But it's this decision to do it no matter what. And like you said, it doesn't, even if you aren't totally feeling it, it's never the wrong decision to worship. It's
Yeah.
never going to make things worse.
Right.
And more often than not, it's going to make things marginally better in your relationship with Him. I love that. Well, this has been huge. I love hearing from worship leaders talking about this idea, because I know that y'all think about it all the time. You know what I'm saying? It's your whole calling in life. And so thanks for sharing with us, Brittany and Aaron. If you want more resources for Flourishing Worship, you can find them on our website and other places. There's all sorts of things that we're trying to give you to help you grow in this area. And so thank you so much for joining us today. And we look forward to our next conversation with you.